Hello, everyone. My name is Michelle Coppoletta, and I'm an ecologist here with the Forest Service in Northeastern California. And my talk today is really going to build on this theme that has been introduced by a lot of the people in this session, actually, about how we might really start to think about applying fire to maintain conditions in some places that people consider to be close to, or in some rare cases, already restored. And to do that, I want to take you all from your home computers to, if I can get my slides to work, the Ishi Wilderness on the Lhasa National Forest. And this spot is located in Northern California. For those of you who've been there, you can attest that it is remote and rugged. And one of the really unique things about this place is that it supports this really small handful of pretty unique forest stands. And these stands are dominated by ponderosa pine and black oak. And because of this, they've been nicknamed the pineries. These places are notoriously difficult to access. And because of that, they've never been harvested. And fire suppression has historically been a lot less effective than it has been in other parts of the Sierra Nevada and Southern Cascades. And today I want to focus on one of these stands, which is the Beaver Creek Pinery, which you can see here in the upper right-hand corner of the slide. And this is often cited as what we call a contemporary reference site. You know, one that has characteristics that we think are pretty similar to what we might expect historically or in similar areas with intact fire regimes. And these areas can be really invaluable to forest managers. They often use information from sites like the Beaver Creek Pinery to develop these benchmarks or what we call desired conditions when they're really using them to design restoration projects in areas that are similar but a lot more altered landscapes. So these places are really important to both management and science. And like much of the West, fire has played a really dominant role and continues to play a really dominant role in the Beaver Creek Pinery. Alan Taylor did a great fire history study using fire scars and found that prior to 1850, fire was a really frequent process in the Beaver Creek Pinery. It burned on average every 8 to 16 years, usually in late summer and early fall. And like much of the West, after 1850, that interval between fires lengthened pretty considerably, coinciding with a lot of increased efforts to suppress fire in these landscapes. But despite our best efforts to exclude fire, the Beaver Creek Pinery did burn 4 times in the 20th century, with the most recent fires occurring in the 1990s. And this next slide shows some severity patterns from those last 2 most recent fires. The fire on the left was the 1990 Campbell fire. And then you can see on the right, just 4 years later, the Barkley fire burned in 1994. And both of these fires burned at predominantly low severity. They were mostly surface fires. And those severity patterns combined with that really short interval between the 2 fires is thought to have really restored stand structure in this pinery. It created these open forest conditions and this really fine scale mosaic of structure that I think many of us consider to be the kind of this hallmark of historical forest structure in a lot of these frequent fire forest types. You can really see that diversity here in this slide. This is just an aerial photograph from the Beaver Creek Pinery, which shows that really diverse spatial structure and that lower tree density. Here you can see that in this pretty small area, we have individual trees here outlined in red that are all interspersed between clumps of trees of varying densities. And then we also have here outlined in the blue, just these small and large openings where you can start to see regenerating pines and shrubs and some black oak. So we have this area, this Beaver Creek Pinery, that many of us consider to be restored by that last fire. It has these conditions that we might expect in areas with intact fire regimes. And I think as managers, it can be really tempting to walk away from places like this. You know, you have an area that's in pretty good shape. It's protected from direct manipulation. Remember, it's in the boundary of a designated wilderness. But I do think it's really, really important to recognize that exclusion of fire as a natural process is a management action, right? It can have really profound effects and consequences, even in areas that are protected from direct manipulation like wilderness. So with this in mind, my colleagues and I were really interested in looking at the Beaver Creek Pinery to understand and investigate kind of two fundamental questions. And the first was, how long will those conditions that were restored by those last two fires persist in the absence of fire? And then the second question is, from a management perspective, what is our window of opportunity as managers to actually maintain these conditions with fire? Because remember, these are in wilderness areas where prescribed fire or managed wildfire is really one of our only options for restoration. So to address these questions, we used a combination of field measurements and modeling. And this diagram just presents a really simplified overview of kind of the timeline that we used and where we applied each of those methods. So you can see after the 1994 Barkley fire, we had this team of researchers establish this really great permanent monitoring grid within the Beaver Creek Pinery. And in 2016, we remeasured all of those plots, taking data on vegetation and fuels, and then we used that data to do a quantitative assessment of how that stand had changed in that more than 20-year absence of fire. And we also used that field data to model changes in vegetation structure into the future using the Forest Vegetation Simulator, or FVS. And we used that to look at the effects of different fires simulated under prescribed and wildfire weather conditions. And we looked at that at different points of time. So we looked at it 22 years after the last fire, where the stand had missed maybe 1 or 2 historic fire return intervals. And then we also looked at the effects of those two fire types 30 and 40 years after that initial fire. And these photos just provide you some idea of the general patterns of change that we saw. You can see on the left-hand side here in 1998, these are photographs of plots taken 4 years after the fire. And then the photographs on the right are in 2016 of those same plots 22 years after the fire. And what we found from our analysis of our field data were that we found significant increases in tree density and basal area, the cover of shrubs in the understory, and we also found increases in litter cover and depth. And not surprisingly, one of the biggest changes that we saw was actually in the density of small trees. And you can see this in this graph here, where you see these really significant increases in the number of small trees in those smaller size classes. And this really represented some pretty amazing ingrowth of pine, ponderosa pine seedlings and saplings as they filled in those gaps in the absence of fire. But despite those changes that we saw in tree density, and especially in the small tree density, when we looked at forest overstory patterns, we really found that a lot of the patterns that we saw were still largely within the historical range of variability for these forest types. So next, after comparing changes in forest structure, we were really interested in understanding, how long these stands remain resilient to fire. And to do that, we compared modeled fire behavior under prescribed fire and 97th percentile wildfire weather conditions. And this graph on this slide shows the predicted flame length at different points in time. And the green dotted line shows the flame length at about 6 feet or 1.8 meters. And that's the flame length that managers generally equate with surface fire and generally set as their desired conditions whenever we're doing treatments. And what we found was that a few years ago, if you look at the 22-year time step or the 25-year time step, both types of fire, prescribed fire and simulated wildfire, resulted in flame lengths that were relatively similar. Prescribed fire resulted in flame lengths that were pretty far below that desired flame length, while wildfire resulted in slightly higher than average flame lengths. But what's really interesting and important to consider here is that over this pretty short period of time, if you look at the 30-year time step, which coincidentally is only 6 years from today, it really jumps dramatically. So you can see the predicted flame length under that wildfire scenario jumps to heights that are above 20 feet or 6 meters, which is often associated with stand replacing or crown fire. We also were really interested in looking at what type of fire was predicted to occur within each of our plots. And these graphs show the number of plots that are predicted to burn under this range of fire types that range from surface fire, where tree crowns are not expected to burn, all the way up to the active crown fire there in red, which shows, which is where plots are expected to burn all or most of the tree crowns in the plot. And what we found is that under the wildfire scenario on the top, you can see that there's an increased number of plots that are burning or predicted to burn under an active crown fire over time. And this contrasts pretty sharply with the graph on the bottom, which is the prescribed fire scenarios, which show that over time, most of our plots continue to be predicted to burn as surface or passive fires, where you have some individual trees or groups of trees that might torch. And this next slide just is a visualization from FVS showing some of these effects. You can see on the left side, we have a wildfire that burns 22 years after that initial fire. And in that case, you have this pretty low mortality. You have about 4% predicted mortality. And what's really important is that it's maintaining those larger trees in the stand. And this contrasts pretty sharply with the visualization on the right, which shows that same plot with a simulated wildfire 40 years after the last fire. And here we have much higher mortality at about 74%. And we're getting a lot more mortality in the larger trees in the stand. So the bottom line from these graphs is that we, at least in the Beaver Creek Pinery, we have a relatively short window of time before conditions in this really important reference stand become a lot more conducive to stand replacing fire. So we were also really interested in, as managers, thinking about what is the window of opportunity that we have to use prescribed fire in these stands as a restoration tool. And this graph shows our predicted basal area here on the y-axis after one of our simulated fires. And the x-axis shows just the number of years between one of our simulated fires and that initial fire in 1994. And the dotted reference line in this graph actually represents the average basal area that we measured 4 years after the last fire in our initial plots in 1998. And what we found was that if we burn early in the time series, when these stands have missed on average about 1, maybe 2 fire return intervals, the basal area after both a simulated wildfire and a prescribed fire are pretty close to that reference condition that we measured in 1998. However, as the time between our simulated wildfire, our simulated prescribed fire and that initial fire increased or lengthened, then we saw an increase in basal area even after applying prescribed fire. So we see a decrease in effectiveness over time. And again, a wildfire simulated 30 or 40 years after that initial fire really reduced the basal area in our plots well below that reference condition. And although I didn't show it in this graph, these fires also really favored the dominance of black oak over pine. So we saw compositional shifts as well. And again, this is just a visualization of how the effectiveness of prescribed fire could diminish over time as these stands develop. On the left, you have a prescribed fire that we implement or simulate 22 years after that initial fire. And you can see that it's pretty effective at thinning out those small diameter trees and reducing the total tree density in those plots while still maintaining those big trees. And this contrasts again with the prescribed burn implemented 40 years after that initial fire. And here we've allowed a lot of those small trees to establish and grow and become a lot more fire resistant. And in this case, prescribed fire is a lot less effective at actually reducing the density of those small trees in that stand and restoring kind of that spatial heterogeneity that we're desired, is part of our desired condition. So all of these findings really point to this, I think. In the absence of fire, I think a lot of these places that are relatively intact, like the Beaver Creek Pinery, can experience pretty substantial change over time, and that these changes are going to influence the resilience to future fire and increase the risk of loss to severe fire effects as they continue to develop. In the Beaver Creek Pinery, we saw this loss of resilience or increased risk of loss after only 30 years after that last restorative fire. We also found that as vegetation and fuels continued to develop, that the effectiveness of our prescribed fire treatments, which again is one of our only options in some of these stands that are in wilderness, that the effectiveness of prescribed burning may become a lot less effective at maintaining and restoring those desired conditions. And so in the case of the Beaver Creek Pinery, we're recommending burning in the very near term. We're in the next 10 years under controlled conditions. And we really think that this is going to be the most effective strategy for reducing that dense ingrowth of small trees and those surface fuels, and for really maintaining that kind of unique heterogeneity that makes this place so important. And we are currently, the good news is we're currently working on turning these results into action with a big group of people that are not listed here, but we are planning a large-scale prescribed fire project in the Ishi Wilderness that we hope to get implemented in the next 2 to 3 years. And these are just a few of the folks listed here that have made this research and this future project possible. So I want to thank everyone. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Michelle. That was really interesting, cool data, and cool tying everything together here. I think we have time for a question or two. If let's see. Well, we have time for maybe one quick question, and then we'll have a break. Anybody?
Got one.
Go for it.
Okay.
Hey, Michelle, I was wondering if managed natural ignitions would be something that the Ishi Wilderness has already or will be considering, and if that's something that's part of this prescribed fire approach that you're referring to for these next 2 to 3 years?
It's a really, really good question. And I think in theory, yes, we want to encourage and consider managed fire, but unfortunately, for anyone who's been here, this landscape is located just north of the campfire in the lower elevation foothills of the Sierra Cascade. And fire managers are really hesitant to manage fire in this landscape. Most fires that burn here get pretty large pretty quickly. And so I think it's going to be more of a proactive approach to applying fire rather than really managing fire. We've had a number of ignitions that have happened since the 90s that we've begged them to let go, and they've been extinguished every time, including this year. We had a fire in the Ishi, so.
Totally understand. Thank you.